The supplementary budget has painted a bleak picture of the South African economy. It shows a deterioration in government finances with a sharp increase in debt and falling revenue collection. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says that the country will miss its tax target for this year by over 300 billion rand. He says the effects of COVID-19 on revenue collection is expected to exceed that of the global financial crisis of 2008-2009.
Treasury says the current crisis is affecting the largest tax bases. It points to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the sharp reduction in collections for domestic VAT and pay-as-you-earn. Personal income taxes are under significant pressure due to job losses and employers' inability to pay full salaries. At the same time, VAT and customs revenue estimates have been revised downward in response to lower confidence. Service and production closures during lockdown and uncertainty of when normal activity will resume have also affected corporate taxes collection. Mboweni says the country is already 35.3 billion rand short of its 2020-2021 target. It says during this period, gross tax revenue collected in the first 2 months was 142 billion rands.
As a consequence, gross tax revenue for 2020-21 fiscal year is revised down from 1.43 trillion rand to 1.12 trillion rand. That means that we are expecting to miss our tax target for the year by some 300 billion rand.
Treasury concedes that in the current year, tax revenue as a proportion of GDP has weakened sharply. The receiver of revenue, meanwhile, will be looking to improve tax collection by focusing on international taxes, increasing enforcement to eliminate VAT fraud, and improving the collection of debt due to the fiscus.
We have seen general tax compliance levels slipping, whether that is companies who ought to register who don't register, companies who should submit and file declarations who don't, a big focus on employers who collect pay-as-you-earn and don't hand it over to SARS. So there's a lot of areas of non-compliance that we will be focusing on and have begun to focus in fact.
Diabosito, SABC News, Johannesburg.
All right, to discuss this, I'm now joined by political economist and managing director of Zehuti Advisory Services, Mandla Isaacs. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. Good evening.
All right, so, let's start with just your reactions, your thoughts, especially now that you've had time to kind of digest what the minister said. What came to mind as he delivered it, and now that you've had a bit of time to think through some of the things that he said?
Well, I think what came to mind for me is that, we've had several finance ministers sounding alarms over the years. This quite literally is the biggest crisis in almost a century. And if we're not able to realize, that we need to fundamentally change our economic trajectory after this budget, then frankly, we're in trouble. And I think the biggest thing that stood out for me, beyond all the numbers, which we can get into, is when he started to outline some of the countries like Argentina, Zimbabwe, Greece, Ukraine, some of the countries that have had significant economic difficulty and debt crises, and basically saying that if we do not do something fundamental, we're on our way to that trajectory, which is where no one wants to be.
So now all countries have been affected by COVID-19, but it does seem that some will get bitten much worse. Is that a function of where these countries were before going into COVID-19? And do we fall into that bracket that we weren't prepared for a massive shock like this?
Well, absolutely. It's the question comes down to, well, your economic fundamentals. What is your national balance sheet? What is your revenue generating capacity? That's going to indicate how far that you can bounce back. Essentially, we haven't recovered from the last economic crisis. Basically, our economy hasn't grown in per capita terms since something like 2006. whereas some of the leading developing countries, the Malaysias, the Thailands, Indonesia, not to mention the Chinas and Indias, I mean, they've grown significantly to the point where their economies have almost doubled in size over that period. And so now, I mean, considering where we were coming from and with this anemic growth, we hadn't grown for a decade. We basically stood still while other countries were racing ahead. With this COVID-19 pandemic and the sharp crisis that we're experiencing, it's going to take us at least 3 or 4 years to get back to where we were when this year started, which is extremely devastating.
All right, so it's clear then that a new way has to happen, and I just wonder, perhaps, if we can get through this emergency, this might be an opportunity to say, okay, what are the things that we should have done before that we need to now set up during this period of time so that when we do come out of it, that there is a new South African way?
Well, certainly, notably, quite interestingly, Minister of Finance seems to be very much in lockstep with the president. You'll notice that he included a line from one of the president's major economic pronouncements saying that we don't want to go back to where the economy we had before this crisis, but we need to build a new economy. And it seems that the president and the finance minister are very much aligned on using this crisis, as well they should, as an opportunity to push through much needed reforms and to start to address some of the economic policy challenges that have been piling up over the last decade or so.
All right, so this debt burden is a huge problem. I mean, South Africans, we are notoriously heavily indebted, and we live literally from sort of month to month. And if we don't work for a couple of months, we literally can go bankrupt. If this debt burden gets to this 80+% that's being projected, I mean, can we actually genuinely ever recover from that?
Certainly we can. I mean, once you hit over the 80% threshold, you start to get into some territory that makes a lot of investors quite nervous. But the question ultimately is about whether we can restart our growth engine. It's one thing to get to have high indebtedness, and if you're paying to consumption and things of that nature, but it's all about the hippo that he talked about, right? If you can get your growth engine restarted, then you can generate income which allows you to pay down that debt over time. But if you're not growing and you're continuing to spend and you're borrowing to sustain that spending, ultimately it's unsustainable. And make no mistake, on our current trajectory, we are heading towards a debt crisis in the next couple of years.
All right, so I'm going to bring in the Secretary General of the trade union SAFTU now into this conversation, Mr. Zwelinzima Vavi. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. What's your view as a leader of a labour union to what the minister said today?
We were expecting pretty much what we got today. We were expecting an intensified assault on the standards of living of the poor through the austerity programs. We were expecting that the government will announce steps towards a zero budgeting. And we got that. There's nothing surprising us anymore. We think that we are living in different planets with this government. We are in a different planet. In our planet, there is a major crisis of unemployment, poverty, and inequalities. In our planet, we have arrived in the hell that the minister was using the metaphor of two gates. We are in the other gate, the hell gate. 63% of the population in that hell already lives in poverty. And the youth have lost hope. They are trapped in drugs. They are trapped in the violence. They are being used by the drug lords to fight their wars. They are roaming the streets and they are hopeless. That's the world we know. On the other world, there's still some danger that may come in the future, we are told, if we don't agree to beat ourselves now before the IMF and the rating agencies beat us. We better beat ourselves now. And in that world, there is no poverty, there is no unemployment. Our unemployment rate at 39.7%, which still does not count everybody that is really unemployed. With counting everybody, easily we will be reaching towards 50%. It's a crisis beyond the crisis. Before the COVID crisis in that world, we were in a deep crisis. And before the 1994 in that world, before the 1994 breakthrough, we were in a deep crisis in that world. And we have to accept that we are operating from different worlds. There is a world of the rich and the small percentage of people who are owners of the mineral wealth, of the land, of the big firms, the white monopoly firms that are controlling the economy of South Africa. But then there is a world of the marginalized black majority who have been promised that there will be jobs, there will be steps taken to address inequalities inherited from colonialism and apartheid, and there will be steps taken to address the levels of poverty in the economy. None of that have happened. In that world, poverty have gone worse over the past 26 years. In that world, inequalities have gone worse. We now have the most unequal society in the world. And in that world, unemployment has gone even worse than it was during the apartheid era. That's the different worlds we're operating from.
All right, so what could have a minister of both worlds have said today that would have been different?
If we had a minister that knows the plight of the poor and the marginalized black majority, we would have expected emergency steps way before even the 2008 world economic crisis. We would have seen, for example, in response to the COVID, a government that will say, guys, we are expecting a major impact on the crisis that we have been living with for 24, 25 years now. And therefore, we want to announce a true, real stimulus package. Now, SAFTU, before the COVID crisis, was calling for a 500 billion stimulus package of real and new money from the economy. And we suggested where that money must be coming from. For example, we suggested that we must introduce wealth tax, a solidarity tax. We propose that government must give us a way to address the fact that the head of the procurement in government was telling us that we are losing 35 to 40% of our procurement budget to tender fraud. We would have expected the government to say we are addressing that issue. And thirdly, we would have expected the government to say, look, guys, we have a 350 billion rands every year that get lost in this economy through illicit cash outflows. And fourthly, we would have heard a government that says we have surplus in the government employee pension fund. We have a surplus in the UIF fund. We have money inside this economy, and this Reserve Bank can take monetary policy steps to get us to have money that we need to build an infrastructure to turn this economy around away from its neo-colonial posting, and which means that we're relying on the extraction of minerals, resources beneath the soil, and then sending it out of the country to be beneficiated elsewhere. We would have seen a government that says the Freedom Charter said the wealth of the country beneath the soil, the monopoly industries, the banks shall be transferred to the ownership of the people as a whole, and therefore we are taking steps to address that. We would have liked to see a government that says we cannot sit in a situation where land still reside with a tiny minority of the citizens, whilst the majority of our people are crammed like sardines in the informal settlements without land. That would have been something that will excite us. We're not going anywhere into that direction. We are now going into being told that there is a big hoho, that we are having a deficit crisis that may reach 81%. We are not being told two factors, that South Africa had at some point 132% deficit in 1932 as a result of the First World War. And that South Africa, because at that time perhaps there was leadership that knows that industrialization in any country is important, building state-owned enterprises that will make the state to play a direct role in the economy is going to be critical in addressing the poverty at that time of a tiny minority of white. And that government for 15 years after that 132 deficit managed to pull so many Afrikaner communities that were poor, uneducated, out of poverty, including the black people who whose labor was inside.
We're running out of time, so I have to interject a little bit, unfortunately. But Mr. Isaacs, there are different stakeholders, different interest groups. Labour is definitely one of them. And so their view, perhaps predictable. Is it realistic, though? I mean, could the minister have incorporated all of the things that Mr. Vavi has mentioned?
Well, I think Mr. Vavi is absolutely correct about one thing, which is that we have a crisis. Before we even came into COVID, we were already in crisis. The type of unemployment levels we've become accustomed to in South Africa would be absolutely shocking to a lot of countries around the world. So we have a structural problem. Our economy has a long-term low growth problem. It has a long-term underemployment problem. And the reality is we simply do not produce goods and services competitively that the world wants to buy. There's a blueprint that the late developing countries have followed. The countries that moved from low income status to the ranks of the advanced countries over the second half of the 20th century, they did so by exporting. They did so by industrializing. They produced goods and services that the world wants to buy. And unfortunately, that's not something that we've done as a country. And that fundamentally is the only answer. You know, we have to become more competitive as an economy. And we do need big, changes. We can't just make tweaks here and there, new policy documents. You know, if there's one thing I agree with the GS on, and I mean, he's touched on a lot of ground, but if there's one thing we absolutely agree on is we need big, bold ideas that fundamentally change the structure of our economy. The tweaks are not going to do it. We absolutely do need big, bold, new solutions.
All right, a question for both of you, and I'm going to start with you, Mr. Isaacs, is can we cut costs? Can we fix this emergency situation without what seems to be obvious job losses?
Well, I mean, I don't know if you can. I think we're going to see fundamental changes. We're seeing obviously job losses in sectors that are face-to-face, that are heavy human contact. This COVID situation is going to be with us for some time. But there are going to be new sectors on the digital side and on the services side that may counteract that. There will be pain, but the question comes down to we need to tool up for the future. We need to go where industries are going. We need to become more competitive. But certainly, it's going to be painful. If you look at tourism, for example, it's been one of our most successful industries. It's very labor intensive, and it's going to be suffering for the next year or two. I'm seeing hotel groups closing hotels, mothballing hotels. There's going to be pain, but what we need to hope for is to use this crisis to make tough decisions, to invite bold solutions, to fundamentally change the structure of our economy and become more competitive so that we can start growing, because we're not going to austerity. I agree with what the GS on one thing. We're not going to austerity cut our way out of this problem. We need to grow our way out of this problem in the medium and long term.
All right, GS, as you've been referred to, can we have tough decisions and a painful transition without losing jobs?
Unfortunately, we have no leadership to talk and to do tough decisions. Look, we've heard about the second phase of radical economic transformation, perhaps at the most appropriate time, when it was becoming clear that South Africa is trapped in a low growth path, that is reproducing poverty, unemployment, and inequalities. We didn't do it in 2008. We sloganized, we factionalized without doing anything. We're now facing the biggest crisis this economy have ever faced. This unemployment rate of 39% is going to get into 50, 60, even 70%. We can't be waiting for an implosion before we find a political will to do what we should have done in 1994. For goodness sake, we hope that this leadership, if it is listening to alternative views, that it will go back to the drawing board as a matter of agency and say, guys, everything that we really believe in has not worked. Market fundamentalism has not worked. Neoliberalism and austerity programs have not worked. We need to begin to say what can work to address these levels, completely unsustainable levels of youth unemployment, African women unemployment, Black unemployment, and their poverty and inequalities. Unless we get a government that begins to ask that question, how do we restructure this economy? How do we move away from it being a colonial post of extraction and not industrialization and not innovation and not education training and not about good healthcare systems that work for all the people instead of the tiny minority? Unless we get to answer those questions, unfortunately, we're going to see an implosion. And that implosion will happen in our country anytime. You're not going to sustain these levels of poverty and inequalities and hope that people are continuously going to listen to the long, meaningless speeches.
All right, so the poor have very little at the moment, but is there any way that they can come to the party? I don't know whether that means reduction in wages, wage cuts, whatever, so that we can get through this emergency situation.
Already there's cuts, by the way. There's 161 billion rands that have been cut from the wages and conditions of employment of the staff of government. Government had to walk out of an agreed-to agreement signed with the unions in 2018 in order to adhere to the austerity project. And that have inspired the private sector capitalists who are now trying to pull out of existing agreements. And I'm sure you would have seen NUMSA having to go to court and embarking on a strike in order to force an existing government. The crisis that was created in New York in 2008 is being solved at the back of the poorest of the poor in the world, and in particular in South Africa, as if we created the crisis. This is a tragedy unfolding. We were saying elsewhere, the minister today was nailing the last nails on the coffins of any possibility that the youth can be liberated from the current levels of poverty, unemployment, and inequality.
All right, Mr. Isaacs, where is this growth going to come from? You talked about growing ourselves out of trouble, but SMMEs have been collapsing even before COVID-19, and we're seeing them disappear and perhaps never come back after COVID-19. So where's the growth going to come from that's going to create these jobs?
Well, I mean, a couple different places. Firstly, you know, if there's one positive that I think we can take this week, is that one of the president's signature programs appears to be infrastructure investment. And there is a major drive to attract hundreds of billions of rands into infrastructure investment, which is one driver of growth. Increasing fixed investment in the economy is a proven driver of growth. But ultimately, the solution is going to come from exports. And that means manufacturing, that means tourism, that means unlocking some of these sectors. Of course, the structural reform agenda is important as well. I mean, our growth has been capped over the last decade because of the fact that Eskom could not guarantee electricity to someone that's wanting to a big industrial user that wants to invest. And so we need to address we need to solve these own goals, such as electricity. We need to get these sectors moving again, get these sectors firing. Tourism is going to be soft for a while. Manufacturing, let's take advantage of the Rand's weakness. It's slid 20 or 30% this year. Let's take advantage to make our exports more competitive. That ultimately is what is going to enable us to grow. We have to produce goods and services that the world wants to buy.
All right. So, and I'm going to go on about labour because it is an important area. Many businesses have complained about the onerous conditions in which they have to operate with regards labour, hiring, firing, and you know, meanwhile in America, you can almost kind of wake up and say, I've got to cut jobs today, and that's the end of it. Whereas here, it's a bit more of a process to protect the workers. Does that mean that we need to re-look labour relations, labour acts and protections that they enjoy at this moment because of the unusual circumstances that we're in?
I'm not convinced that the labor regime overall needs to be completely overhauled. I think some of those hard-won protections are important, but I do think we need flexibility, in particular for small business. I do think some of our small business sector cannot be held to some of the same labor regulations that make sense for larger businesses. There's been discussions around the need to not hold small businesses accountable to collective bargaining agreements across sectors. I do think you need a regime that makes sense for a company that only has a handful of employees, 5, 10 employees. And I do think things like the youth wage subsidies have been tried. You know, Mr. Vavi has talked about the youth and how many of our youth are excluded from labor markets. And ultimately, it's not just about education, it's about apprenticeship. Our young people need work experience. And so I think we've seen some success around wage subsidies that incentivize businesses to give that young person their first work opportunity, to give them some experience, get them some networks, let them get into the labor market. And so I think we need to build on some of those ideas.
Mr. Vavi?
Look, this South Africa has its own history. In this country, we were colonized by a group of about 10% of the population that imposed discrimination and conditions of slavery whilst being residents in the same country in the best interest of the imperialist masters. At the end of a conflict, there was a settlement. And part of that settlement is a Bill of Rights that doesn't exist in America. And our Bill of Rights, amongst others, says that workers shall have a right to fair labor standards, shall have a right to join unions and embark on a strike in order to settle disputes. That's a settlement. If you want to undo that settlement, we are calling for a war. We must go back to the bushes, and we must go back to where we were before 1994 and have another big conflict. Nobody is going to achieve that. We're not going to roll back the clock back to 1917 and or before 1994, only in relation to workers' rights, and everything else can stay the same. We demand the same protections for workers as we are demanding for our environment, for our rivers, and for our seas, and for our air. We are as equal as all of those things, or as important as all of those things in order to develop. Now, I've been sitting here waiting for an employer who can say, in this country, we cannot hire people we want to hire because the labor laws won't allow us to do so. We cannot fire people who are inefficient or who are involved in misconduct because the laws of this country don't allow us to fire people who are inefficient and or who are basically not helping us to produce more. No such a debate. There is always a general call that is not based on anything for improved and intensified levels of flexibility, which is a disguised way of calling for the rolling back of the gains workers have made under the new constitution. That's not about to happen. The trade union and the workers' rights are a reality, just like the human rights, the women's rights, and the right to education and healthcare are the fundamental stones of our democracy. Don't dismantle that framework. Otherwise, you're going to be asking for trouble.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'd love to continue with this discussion. So much to unpack in the supplementary budget that was presented today. But thanks so much for your insights and your time this evening to both of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, so that's a view on the supplementary budget that was delivered by the Finance Minister a little bit earlier this afternoon, and not a lot of people happy with what he had to say, some saying that he was scant with details, but I suspect that various ministers in the coming days will probably start to give us a bit more detail based on how much they've been given and support that they've been given.